Hello, I'm Madison Lowry, and I'm here with Miss Angela Turkelson for information about the teacher strike that occurred the beginning of this year. So, I knew you when you taught in Connor Street Elementary School, and now you're teaching here in West Virginia. So, did you grow up here? Is that why you decided to teach in West Virginia?
I did. I'm actually a Hurricane High School graduate.
Really?
And went through Putnam County schools since I was in the 4th grade.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
How long have you been teaching?
This is my 21st year in the classroom.
That's really cool. Have they all been in West Virginia, or have you gone back?
No, I started my career in Kanawha County, and I was a long-term substitute for 4 years, and then I moved to Colorado and taught in Colorado for 5 years, just in a suburb of Denver called Commerce City, and then I came back to Putnam County, and I've been here ever since.
How is that different, schools in Denver, Colorado, compared to here?
When I taught in Colorado, I taught in the area was called Commerce City, Adams District 14, School District 14, and I was in a very migrant Hispanic community. The school I taught in had 4 of every grade level. It was elementary, and 1 of each of the 3 classrooms at every grade level was entirely Spanish speaking.
Oh, really?
So we had a lot of families that came and went through the year. They followed the growing season. So if they were in Colorado for strawberries or whatever the crop was at the time, corn or whatever, they may have moved on into Iowa or Nebraska as the corn season came in. Their families moved with the work. So we had a population that always came back, but sometimes they would be gone for a couple of months and then they'd come back when a new season started that their families were working. We had a lot of gang activity in that area. We had gang training once a year, sometimes more, so that we could look for signs and know what was going on and how to handle it. So it was definitely a different environment than teaching here in Putnam County, where everything is a little more people have steady work. They're not following a job from season to season, and we definitely don't have the cultural diversity that we had there in Colorado.
Have you had to have sort of trainings like that, specifically to West Virginia? Have you had a specific training to teach here?
I haven't had anything in particular, but I have done some professional development and some continuing education around Ruby Payne's Cycle of Poverty, and it talks about, which really worked in both settings, but kind of understanding how poverty affects student achievement and student outcomes. And I've also had some training about, building relationships with the community and how to work with parents and that kind of thing, because students are in the classroom almost as much as they're at home during their waking hours. So this is like a second home, and we need to make sure that we're prepared and understanding that what's going on at home will certainly reflect what's going on in the classroom. So we all have to work together.
And you attended the teacher strike that happened earlier this year in February, correct?
I did.
How are you associated with that? Other than obviously being a teacher and being a part of it.
Other than being a teacher, I am the president of the American Federation of Teachers chapter here in Putnam County. I'm also a member of the state level executive board. So in leadership, as a leader here in Putnam County, I was trying to keep members and non-members informed of what was going on, where things were happening, meetings, rallies, where picket lines were happening across the county, informational pickets, not a true picket line, because our schools were closed, but making sure that we had people stationed around the county so that the public was aware of what was going on, as well as getting people to the Capitol and updating them if the building had reached capacity, if there was going to be a press conference, things like that. And I was getting that information directly from our state level president of the teachers union, because I'm an executive board member and a local president. So I was at the Capitol every single day during the strike, even on the Saturdays and Sundays. I had meetings in the county in the evenings, a lot of times, not just for our membership, but for for any teacher or service personnel, which includes custodians, cooks, bus drivers, maintenance. We had several meetings at local churches that reached out and gave us their space just to kind of tell people what was going on, and making sure that we understood what it was that we were out for, and where our superintendent and our school board was on our issues, and they did support us 100% of the time.
That's really good.
Which was good. And I was in constant communication with Mr. Hudson, our superintendent, and Mr. Hodges, our assistant superintendent. I was in constant communication with the staff of the teachers union and the other organizational leadership in the county. So I was a busy girl during the strike, and then just answering texts and phone calls kind of 24/7 about people who were, where's this going? I'm worried about my job. I want to get back in the classroom.
Really?
I can't believe they said that today. What are we going to do? So it was a constant. It was, a good solid 3 weeks of just chaos.
Oh, 3 whole weeks, right?
Well, because we had, prior to everyone going out in that 55 United movement, it actually started, I should say 4 weeks, I guess, because there was a small group that went out first of 4 southern counties, and they went out on their own on a weekday so that they could go to the Capitol and then picket in their area. That same group of people were the first group to go out of the teachers' strike back in the late 80s, early 90s. So they've kind of started that movement, and then they went back into the classroom. It was kind of a one-day walkout saying, we're not going to take this. You've got to do something. It was an eye-opener, if you will. And then the following week, we had another couple of counties that did the same thing. But then that next week, everyone was out, and we were out 55 strong, all 55 counties for the duration of the strike. So.
And you said you created many meetings and rallies before the initial strike for our school, specifically, right? So, our area at least. So, how many rallies or those meetings do you think happened before the initial, where 55 United were all getting out?
Before everyone went out, we probably had 1 to 2 informational meetings per week. So we probably had 3 or 4 going into it, just kind of telling people what was going on, what our game plan was, what was, like I said, I was communicating with the superintendent, and in addition to knowing this was coming, we also had to look at things that were on Putnam County's schedule and trying to make sure that we were doing what was right for students and families and all that kind of thing. But and then once the strike got started, even after a long day at the Capitol or on the picket line, we would still come together occasionally, sometimes 300 or 400 people to talk about what's going on. And not everybody was always on the same page. Some people were thrilled to be out, and they loved what they were doing, and they'd probably stayed out longer. And a lot of people were aggravated and upset and worried about their students and their classroom, and just wanted to get back. And then we had people who wanted more. They felt like we didn't get enough, we didn't ask for enough, we should have held out for a longer duration of time. But the consensus was among leadership that we really got all we were going to get at the time, and it was only, going to work against us if we stayed out much longer.
Really? Yeah. So in the beginning there was a lot of planning, and then there was the initial strike for that 13, is that correct? 13
days.
Was there a deciding factor that was we're striking now, or was it this is the convenient time to do it?
It wasn't really, I wouldn't say it was convenient. It's never a convenient time to walk out of your classroom and walk away. And walk away from your school. It was just, there had been a press conference, there was a statement made. There were different statements made on what they weren't going to pass and what they weren't going to do. And it had finally reached a point where, I like I said, one kind of 4-county group went out, and then there was another little 4-county group that went out, and making those small gestures wasn't having a big enough impact on the legislators, and they weren't realizing that, you know, a few hundred people's not a big deal, because you had people back in their counties and people at the Capitol, and it just wasn't a big enough showing.
So it was more people staying back than going forward?
Yes, and when you look at just like, you know, in the beginning we were talking about Mingo County and Logan County, and they don't have, like, when you compare them to Putnam, they don't have the number of schools that we have and the number of staff that we have. It's just a smaller community, less schools. So you're not talking about just the volume of people needed to make a huge statement. So it came to be, you know, we talked about this kind of a rolling strike option, and that's kind of what it was. Like, here's a warning, here's another one. And it, you know, there was talk that we were going to do them by kind of sections of the state. So maybe Putnam and a few other counties would go out, and then another one would go out. And we realized it just wasn't making a big enough impact, that we needed everyone there, and they needed to see that we were willing to stand together and stand strong, and they had to address our issues. Because for years in the legislature, they've not addressed the teacher pay raise. They've not addressed the fact that we have over 700 jobs that aren't filled right now.
Really?
Across the state. They have not addressed the fact that we do not have enough money for our public schools to get the materials that we need for our students. And they have not honored keeping up their piece of the insurance. And that was a big deal. PEIA was one of the deciding real pushes to go out, and we had year-long rallies, or informational meetings. They call them rallies, but they're more like informational question and answer kind of things, scheduled around the state every year for PEIA. So it talks about upcoming changes to our insurance program, you know, co-pays that are going to change, visits that are going to change, what doctors you can and can't see, how much more it's going to cost out of pocket for teachers and their families. And nothing was happening. We were showing up at those meetings. We were telling our stories, how, you know, some people are making a choice between a medicine they need and paying their bills, and it was an effort that teachers and employees on public PEIA were making that just wasn't being heard. So that really kind of pushed everybody into it as well, because we feel like we'd done the prep work, and we were asking for raises regularly and insurance to be fixed, and they were just ignoring us. And in turn, they were hoping to, you know, pass legislation that included bringing private charter schools into our area, taking away our insurance altogether, taking away our planning periods and our duty-free lunch. Like, all of that's in legislation that could be taken away at any time. So when we don't have a friendly legislative body, they often will work against us. So we have to make sure that we're speaking up and standing up, and the strike really pushed us to that. And so when you have, you know, thousands of people inside and outside of the Capitol on any given day, it makes a big statement. So I think we got our point across, and it certainly kind of set in motion something we didn't expect, which was this movement that has kind of gone across the nation. And education has been overlooked for far too long, and ultimately they want to blame everything on poor school systems and inadequate teachers, when really our government is failing our school systems by not providing them with competitive salaries based on their education. Teachers are some of the most educated people in the world, but our salaries don't reflect that.
Yeah, and you educate the future jobs that are
exactly
more.
Exactly. And without good public schools and strong teachers, you don't have strong students coming out.
Yeah.
So your doctors aren't going to be as good as they used to be, or, you know, your whatever. You know, we're educating everybody from garbage men to dentists and doctors and you know, nuclear physicists, but everybody deserves to have a good public education, and it requires good funding to make that happen.
So while you were at the Capitol, what were things that like went on? Like how many people do you think showed up, and like who did you talk to, and like what was that experience like?
Well, when you're at the Capitol, you get there and you wait in line because there's only 2 entrances to our Capitol now, and you have to go through screening. Now, our elected officials don't. They have key cards and they can go in different doors, but the general public has to wait in line. They have to go through a metal detector. There were days that I waited 30 minutes or less, and there were days that I waited a couple hours
Just to get in?
just to get in. One day when I went up and I'd had a meeting at our union office prior to going over, and we literally got in line on the far side of the cultural center and wrapped all the way around the cultural center, which is adjacent to the Capitol property, all the way around, and then in line to the Capitol itself. There were several days that I was there, and you would look out the window as you were going to an office to visit a delegate or a senator, and you would see the line wrapped all the way around the
Really?
Capitol block. People waited for hours sometimes to get in. People waited for hours and sometimes didn't get in because the fire marshal shut down the building for capacity. It was shoulder-to-shoulder people in the Capitol, especially on that second floor where the House and Senate chambers are. From door to door across the entire length of the Capitol was shoulder-to-shoulder people standing and chanting and waving their signs, talking to media. And then downstairs on the level where there are offices, there were still people. It wasn't quite shoulder-to-shoulder, but there was still a good crowd of people. And then out in the wings where different Senate offices and House of Delegate offices are, there were always people in and out. And your goal when you were there was either to stand and chant and wave your sign, talk to the press if you got that opportunity, to go either to the House or the Senate if they were in session, and sit in the chambers and make sure those chambers were full, which they were always, in standing room only outside of those chambers so that you could hear. Or you were visiting, you were trying to sit in on a committee meeting that might have dealt with funding or a bill that was being proposed that may help or harm education, or you were trying to sit down face to face with your Senate representative or your delegates that are elected in your area to kind of talk to them. Hey, what are you doing for me? I really want you to vote no on this. Why are you, why do you support this bill? How can you help us? Here's what we need from you. And most, it was really obvious through the strike who was on our side, who was with us, and who was against us. And you can look that's public record. You can look it up as how people voted on different bills and proposals. But our friends wore ribbons on their lapels, on their jackets or their tops if they were women. A blue ribbon representing the American Federation of Teachers Union, a red ribbon for West Virginia Education Association, which are also teachers, administrators, service employees, and yellow, which represents the West Virginia School Service personnel. And those are the 3 big organizations in our area, and they wore those ribbons every day. What was funny, during that time we had fakers that made their own ribbons and would come out because they didn't want to be what they felt like was attacked when they came out into the hallways. But we knew who was who because we were watching voting records. We were sitting in those sessions. We were listening to the conversations being had. So there wasn't any real, and they got called out on it often.
Really? I mean,
they
deserve to be called out.
There's friends and there's non-friends,
Yeah.
and they were definitely not friends, and we weren't going to give them the credit of being friends. But we also had some people in our Capitol building who refused to see people.
Really?
Delegate Higginbotham, who is on the other side of the river in the Buffalo area, he actually said that he felt threatened for his life and needed a restraining order because he was getting death threats and phone calls, and those kind of things just weren't happening. People were mad, they were angry, they were upset, but they were reasonable. You know, we're fighting for our job.
People definitely didn't go that
No,
far.
no one was going that far.
Yeah.
We were mad, we were angry, we were upset, but we were fighting for our future. We were fighting for you and for the other students of Putnam County. We were fighting for our community and our schools.
And I'm very thankful for that. Thank you.
You're welcome. But, you know, and then we had, for example, our Attorney General, Patrick Morrissey. He actually, we have in our Capitol, we have a display of the black bear, and it's an actual taxidermied black bear. He's on a beautiful pedestal with wheels or whatever. He actually pulled it in front of his office doors, closed his office doors, the public entrance to the offices, and pulled that bear in and roped him off because he didn't want to see people during that time, and he did not see people during that time. If you called the office, he wasn't available. He did not entertain his constituents, his voters, or the people of West Virginia.
Well, don't you have to listen to your voters?
You should. You should always listen to your voters. But if you're unavailable, you know, we can all make ourselves unavailable if we want to. Oh, I have a meeting. Oh, I'm in a, you know, oh, I have an appointment. Oh, I've got people in my office, whatever. But when you do something that blatant and say, I'm not welcoming people in my office, that was kind of obvious. And we did have people who, non-friendly legislators, who made sure that they had an escort, a police escort, as they left the chambers and went to their offices. If they couldn't take a back route, although we pretty much had the place covered. So, but if they had to come out into the crowd, they normally would take a police escort with them and just kind of, you know, hunker their heads down and move swiftly through. But even unfriendly legislators did talk to us. You know, Senator Carmichael, who represents our area, spoke to us, and he listened and he nodded and he smiled like he's done for years. But he still didn't show us what we needed him to show us on the floor.
There's a difference between listening and acting.
There's a difference between just hearing what somebody's saying and listening and taking what your constituents are telling you they want and need versus what big business and corporations and that kind of thing want and need. And that was a big devise, certainly, and it's happening now again as we move into the November elections.
So that was my next question. Like, were people rude to you personally there, and are people rude to you about it like now, like after it's over?
I didn't have anybody that was particularly rude to me, although, you know, when emotions are high, you know, even looking at other educators around the county, when emotions are running high and you're kind of, you know, you're in this state of being exhausted from what's going on. You're out of your routine. You're not in your classroom. You're worrying about where this is going. Emotions ran really high, and there were often people who snapped, and I knew they didn't mean me personally, but they were upset with maybe they thought things were moving too slow, or they thought, you know, their interests weren't being met. And with leadership, you have to look at what's going to benefit everyone, maybe not one person in particular, but what's the best we can do for everyone. And in West Virginia, we don't have collective bargaining, so we're not a true union in the sense that we sit down, their representatives, our representatives, and we hammer back and forth an agreement, an arrangement. They write a bill, they pass it or they don't pass it. We can ask for some input, we can ask, but ultimately they don't have to entertain anything we say or do, you know, although they're representing us and that's what they're supposed to do. There's no contractual obligations that say you had, you know, you said you'd give us this and it needs to happen by 12 o'clock. You know, when Kroger goes on strike or the United Mine Workers go on strike, they're sitting down at the table with negotiators and a contract, and ours doesn't quite work like that. So we're working on the good judgment and the honesty and the respect of the legislature, and it's not always where it needs to be.
Yeah. So what, like, you went off strike, so did you get some, like, obviously you got something out of it, but are you, like, what did you get from it? Or teachers in general, not just you?
Well, there was a 5% pay raise that was put into effect that actually started with our September paychecks, and PEIA, which was the insurance, which was one of our big things, was frozen, and a task force was appointed. So frozen means that there were no additional increases that were going to take place until this task force that was assigned did some work and looked into some options. But that task force has to have a report and a solution by, and it's coming up, I think it's November 1st maybe.
That's like not even a whole month away.
It's not even a whole month away, but they were working on it, from March forward. That task force was appointed. Originally, it was a very small task force. There were no women appointed and no educators. So
that seems kind of a little bit sketchy.
It's a little sketchy, exactly. But we fought that, and we did get some women on there and some educators, and they have met and they have traveled across the state again to listen to what people had to say, kind of like those meetings that have gone on every year that we've had. And we haven't heard any solutions yet. Now, Governor Justice has come out, and Senator Carmichael, and said we found this money, we're going to give you an additional raise, and we're going to fix PEIA. And they can't just say they're going to do that. They can't make that promise. It's an empty promise, because all of that has to be approved through the legislature, who's not in session right now. It's kind of a ploy with elections coming up. Early voting starts on the 24th of October. So they're trying to spin themselves in a positive light, like, we're going to do all this for you. So let's not remember in November, is what we said. We'll vote them out. We're going to remember in November, because election day's in November. And they're panicking right now, because if the group of people who came out every day, either to a picket line or the Capitol or in their community, and said they'd had enough, if they go to the polls and vote those folks out, we could really change the face of the legislature. We could switch the House and the Senate from a Republican majority to a Democratic majority, and have people in there who we know are going to work for us. And so they're trying to get the public to look like, oh, they're giving them what they want, I'm going to vote for them again. Look at all the great they're doing right now. But it's an empty promise, because none of that's been passed in legislation. So they can say that and then get voted in and then not honor any of it.
So they're not following through with what they said at the end?
The originals, but this is an additional promise of another 5% and a fix for PEIA, which is supposed to, the fix is supposed to be happening anyway. But it's really just a diversion tactic to try to get reelected, because they know that if people remember what happened in February and March, that they are in jeopardy of losing their positions for not supporting us in the first place. Yeah.
So there was a strike for educators and public service personnel in the 90s, correct?
Yes.
And there was one earlier this year. So do you think there will be another one in the future?
I hope not.
Yeah, I really hope not too.
I hope not. You never want to go on strike, but at some point, and we had enough. We had not just lost pay and insurance benefits, but we had really lost the respect of our governing bodies, and even of some of our community. And all that goes back to, teachers are some of the hardest working people. And like I said earlier, we are also some of, we have multiple degrees, many of us. We're some of the most educated people. We've got the most prized possession in our hands every day. You and your students across the state and across the country. And people don't find what we do as important, and they've just kind of lost a lack of respect for the teaching profession. And we deserve to be respected for what we do. We deserve to be compensated for what we do. So hopefully there will not be another strike in our future. But if our legislators don't follow through, there very well could be. And it will be very different than the last one, because what happened back in February, March was really a work stoppage because our superintendents agreed to shut down our schools so that we could do what we needed to do. And we made those days up. So we had to work for those days to get paid for those days, but we were compensated for them. When you really go on strike, which is probably what would happen if we go out again, is our school systems are going to try to stay open. There'll be teachers who will go to the classroom because they can't afford to miss that paycheck, or they want to be there for their students who are going to show up. There'll be bus drivers who choose to drive their route and get kids to school. There'll be some cooks that will come in and some custodians. So we'll have in a real, in a strike like they had back in the 90s, there were picket lines that were set up not to cross, but there were people who crossed them that needed to work for one reason or another, or who didn't believe in the cause. But if you were on that picket line, you weren't getting a paycheck. So if you weren't in the classroom, you weren't getting paid. And that wasn't the case this time around, but it could very well be the case the next time around. So I think everybody's hoping that they will have a fix for PEIA. We will get some additional support in our West Virginia legislature so that we kind of change the narrative for West Virginia, the West Virginia education system, and for public employees. But I hope we don't have to strike again. But if we do, we will. It's not to say that we never will, but we've got to keep working for public education, because it is something that every student's entitled to, is a free public education, and they deserve the best education possible, which means our schools deserve to be funded, fully funded. Our teachers deserve to be respected and paid and compensated in ways that are appropriate for their level of education and expertise.
Like how it is in most careers, if I do recall, right? The farther you go up, that's competitive pay, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, if, the reason our pharmacists and our doctors, let's say, make as much money as they do, they have 8 years of college in. Well, some of us do too. I have a double bachelor's degree. I have a master's degree. I have a principal's certification. I have law. I have a master's plus 60 right now. The next thing for me to do would be to get a doctorate degree. There are lots of teachers that are the same way. We have people who've taken national board certifications. But if you look at my rate of pay versus my education, which could be equivalent to maybe, a local brain surgeon. Like, we're not making the same amount of money. We're not putting in, and not to say they don't deserve a good pay, because they do. But pay also needs to reflect the amount of education and training that you have for your job. And if you're in the top of your field, then you should be paid as you're in the top of your field. And we certainly have all levels of teachers. We have teachers that are fresh out of college with a bachelor's degree. We also have teachers that have doctorates. We have teachers that have national board certification. But people, some of our service personnel are being paid as much or less than if they worked, ran a cash register at Walmart or Kroger. So they need to look at competitive salaries and salaries across the United States. We have teachers that cross the borders into Maryland or Virginia or Ohio, even Pennsylvania, that can do the same job 10 minutes from their house and make $10,000 more than they do, in West Virginia, or sometimes more than that. So we have to be competitive. And that's the way that we fill those empty teacher positions. If we have, like I said, at this point last year in March, we had over 700 vacancies that we can't get filled in West Virginia. And I apologize, I don't know what the exact number is now, but I don't think it's gotten a lot better. But if we're not offering people good benefits and a salary that they can raise their family on and pay their bills and make their ends meet without having to take a second or a third job, people are not going to come to West Virginia and work in our education system. They're just not going to do it. And we have a lot of good teachers that are leaving the education field for another career choice because they can't make the pay they need to feed their families.
Yeah, that's what I've heard, like, as a student who's listening to other students go, like, to get their degrees. And not a lot of people, like, back when I was in elementary school, a lot of people were saying, oh, I'd like to be a teacher, oh, I'd like to be a teacher. But now people are saying, like, oh, this, and this. And it's really, so I think the strike has really benefited us in general. So I think
I hope so. I hope so. I do. You know, because like I said, like you've said, and teaching is our future. We're teaching our future. We prepare people for all professions. And if we don't have kids that want to go into teaching, that number is just going to continue to grow. We do have kids, we do have people, you know, we have lots of people still going into education programs at our colleges here in West Virginia. And I had somebody tell me once that West Virginia is an excellent training ground for teachers. We have good education programs in our colleges. We have good preparedness programs. People get their degrees and they move away because they can't make the money they need here. And we need to not just be a training ground. We need to be, we need to have something that entices people to stay home, because most people want to be here. I loved West Virginia. I moved away for personal reasons and other things, but I made great money in Colorado, significantly more than I did here. And but I came home because I grew up here. I missed my family and my friends, and I made a choice to move home and take that pay cut. But not everybody can do that. So we've got to make teaching a realistic job for people who want to stay in West Virginia.
So thank you for everything you do for us students. Thank you for fighting for what you believe in, and thank you for making West Virginia a better place.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for meeting me today for this interview.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.